Saturn, Ancient Linguistics, and the Legacy of Symbolism. Introduction. From the deserts and river valleys of the ancient Near East to the corridors of modern power and space exploration, the symbolism of Saturn has left a remarkable imprint on human civilization. Across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean, Saturn was linked to cosmic cycles, authority, and law, weaving its influence through Amorite, Canaanite, Phoenician, and early Israelite religion. This celestial archetype intersected with serpent and solar symbolism, astronomical observation, and sacred geometry, leaving traces in the hexagram, temple architecture, ritual practices, and language. Over millennia, Saturnian motifs persisted, appearing in Roman and Greco-Phoenician syncretism, Jewish mysticism, Masonic symbolism, and even modern technological and occult movements, including the development of NASA and the Saturn rocket program. By tracing the threads from ancient linguistics, religion, and symbolism to contemporary interpretations, this study explores how Saturn has functioned as a persistent archetype of cosmic order, authority, and ritual significance throughout human history. Amorites. The Amorites were a West Semitic-speaking semi-nomadic pastoralists, agriculturalists and tribal people who emerged in the early 2nd millennium BCE, inhabiting northern Mesopotamia and parts of Syria, and later migrating into southern Mesopotamia and the Levant. Initially tribal and pastoral, they established city-states and dynasties, including the Amorite rulers of Babylon, such as Hammurabi. Their religion was polytheistic, closely linked to the broader Mesopotamian pantheon, worshipping deities like Anu the sky god, Enlil the god of authority, Ishtar the goddess of fertility and war, and Sin, Nomnar, the moon god, while also adopting local gods in newly settled areas. Through migration, trade, and intermarriage, Amorite religious and cultural practices influenced the Canaanites, introducing Mesopotamian myths, ritual forms, and celestial symbolism. In this context, Baal, a central Canaanite storm and fertility god, began to absorb attributes linked to cosmic cycles, time, and celestial authority, qualities also associated with the planet Saturn in Mesopotamian and later Phoenician thought. The Phoenician adaptation of Baal into Baal-Hamon, worshipped in Carthage, was explicitly identified by Greeks and Romans with Cronus, Saturn, demonstrating a continuity of Saturnian symbolism from Mesopotamia through the Amorite cultural influence into Canaanite religion. This syncretism not only shaped the pantheon and rituals of the Canaanites, but also laid the symbolic groundwork for later interpretations that associate Yahweh, Baal, and Saturn through shared traits of law, cycles, and cosmic authority. The Amorites through migration carried cultural, linguistic, and religious traits that later mixed with Levantine populations, influencing the Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews and early Israelites. Canaan and Canaanites refers to the Levantine coastal and inland region roughly covering modern-day Palestine, occupied Palestine or Israel, Lebanon, western Jordan, and parts of Syria. The Canaanites were not a single unified ethnic group, but a collection of city-states, Ugarit, Tyre, Sidon, Hazor, Megiddo, etc., that shared a similar language, religious system, and material culture. Canaanite origins. Archaeological evidence suggests that Canaanite culture emerged locally out of the early Bronze Age Levantine populations, somewhere around 3000 to 2000 BCE. DNA studies, such as the 2017 Harvard and Israeli study on ancient Canaanite remains, indicate that they descended from indigenous Neolithic and Chalcolithic Levantine farmers and herders who mixed with incoming Semitic-speaking peoples from the northeast. Often associated with Amorite migrations from the northern Mesopotamian region, the Bronze Age, some scholars suggest that the broader ancestral populations of these migrants may have had connections to areas near the Zagros Mountains, a large mountain range in western Iran, extending into northeastern Iraq and touching the border regions near southeastern Turkey. This mix created the distinct Northwest Semitic cultural linguistic group we call the Canaanites, Canaanite language and ethnicity. The Canaanite language branch is part of the Northwest Semitic family. It is the ancestor of Hebrew, Phoenician, and Moabite. Linguistic evidence ties them closely to Amorites, a West Semitic people who migrated from the Syrian desert into Mesopotamia and the Levant during the early 2nd millennium BCE. Egyptian texts from the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, mention trade and warfare with people from Canaan. The Amarna letters from the 14th century BCE, diplomatic correspondence in Akkadian, show Canaanite city-state rulers interacting with Egypt, which controlled much of Canaan at the time. Mesopotamian sources also mention Canaanite and Amorite peoples, linking them to West Semitic tribal confederations. Canaanite religion. The Canaanite religion was a polytheistic system centered on a pantheon of gods, with 𝗼𝗲𝗱𝗲𝗍, who presided over the cosmos. Other major deities included 𝗼𝗆𝗱𝗲𝗍, the storm and fertility god; 𝗍𝗆𝗆, the mother goddess; 𝗏𝗏𝗏, a war and hunting goddess; 𝗧𝗿𝗆𝗏𝗏𝗏, Ashtartes, a prominent goddess associated with fertility, sexuality, and war; 𝗏𝗏, the god of the sea; and 𝗏, the god of death and the underworld. This pantheon, and its associated myths, were largely rooted in indigenous Levantine culture, but archaeological and comparative studies suggest significant influences from Amorite and broader Mesopotamian religion, introduced through migration, trade, and cultural contact. The Amorites, who migrated from northern Mesopotamia and Syria during the Bronze Age, worshipped a similar polytheistic pantheon, including Anu the sky god, Enlil the god of authority and kingship, Ishtar the goddess of fertility, love, and war, and Sin, Nonna, the moon god. These deities shared thematic parallels with Canaanite gods. For example, 𝗏𝗆𝗆𝗏 as a storm and fertility god parallels Mesopotamian storm and weather deities like 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, who was sometimes syncretized with Amorite religious ideas. 𝗼𝗆𝗆𝗏𝗏 god role mirrors the sky authority of Anu and Enlil, and 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Astarte reflect aspects of Ishtar's martial and sexual power. Through this cultural and religious syncretism, the Canaanites adapted some of the cosmic, ritual, and symbolic frameworks of the Amorites and Mesopotamians, while maintaining uniquely Levantine myths and practices. This exchange laid the foundation for later developments in Phoenician religion, where deities like 𝗏𝗆𝗆𝗏 inherited traits linked to cosmic authority and cycles, traits that Romans and Greeks later identified with Cronus, Saturn, showing a clear thread of continuity from Amorite religious motifs into Canaanite and Mediterranean traditions. Canaanites and Near Eastern serpent and solar worship. In Mesopotamia, specifically Akkadian texts, the planet Saturn was called Kyamnu, and in Northwest Semitic languages, it was referred to as Kiyan or Kaiwan. While Canaanite religion did not make Saturn the supreme deity, planetary worship was part of the wider Near Eastern religious environment, influencing Amorite, Phoenician, and early Israelite practices. Archaeological and iconographic evidence shows that several gods, including 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and other storm or fertility deities, were sometimes depicted with serpent-like features, symbolizing chaos, wisdom, or the underworld, while later artistic and religious traditions incorporated solar attributes, associating these deities with life-giving energy, cycles, and cosmic order. This blending of serpent and solar symbolism can be traced through Amorite religious motifs into Canaanite city-states, Phoenician coastal cults, and the emerging Israelite religion, where serpentine imagery appears in iconography, and solar motifs appear in temple symbolism and festival cycles. The result is a complex syncretism in which astral bodies, serpent forms, and solar power converge, shaping the religious imagination across the Levant and creating a framework in which deities could be simultaneously associated with cosmic authority, fertility, death, and renewal, laying the foundation for later associations between gods like Baal, 𝗆𝗏, and the planetary figure of Saturn. Split into regional cultures 1500 to 1000 BCE, Phoenicians were northern Canaanites, based in coastal cities such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblus and Arwad. They retained the Canaanite pantheon almost intact. El and Baal was still central, Baal-Hammon in later Phoenician. Punic religion would be equated by the Greeks with Cronus, and by the Romans with Saturn, making a direct Baal-Saturn identification. The Phoenicians spread culture via trade colonies, most famously Carthage in North Africa. Early Israelites were hill country Canaanites. They emerged from rural Canaanite-speaking populations in the highlands around 1200 BCE. They likely began as a 𝗆𝗏-centered movement among Canaanites, absorbing some elements from Midianite, Kenite groups to the south. The Hebrew Bible shows a transition from polytheism, syncretism, 𝗆𝗏 alongside Baal, Asherah, etc., to strict monotheism. The Saturn link comes from Amos 5:26, where it mentions Kiyan, believed to be Saturn, as something Israelites worshipped alongside 𝗆𝗏 in early syncretistic phases. Later, Roman and Greek writers sometimes equated 𝗆𝗏 with Cronus, Saturn because of the Sabbath, Saturn's day, and 𝗆𝗏's perceived role as a strict lawgiver. Carthaginians, 1000 to 200 BCE, were Phoenician settlers who founded Carthage, in modern Tunisia, around 814 BCE. Baal-Hammon became the chief god, with Tanit as a consort goddess. Baal-Hammon's traits included an agricultural and time god associated with sacrifice and cyclical renewal, were identified by Greeks with Cronus and by Romans with Saturn. This is one of the clearest direct Saturn identifications in the ancient Mediterranean. Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews, Israelites, Greco-Roman syncretism. In the ancient Near East, the planets were more than celestial bodies. They were woven into the religious and linguistic fabric of entire civilizations. Across the Levant, the Phoenicians and Canaanites developed their own pantheon, where certain traits of planetary deities overlapped with local gods, such as Baal. Some comparative religion researchers argue that early Hebrew traditions, emerging within this cultural sphere, may have inherited or adapted symbolic associations that linked their deity 𝗆𝗏 with aspects of Saturn. Phoenician sources don't explicitly equate Baal with Saturn, but Greco-Roman syncretism sometimes merged Baal-Hammon with Cronus, the Greek counterpart of Saturn. Early 𝗆𝗏ism, as practiced in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, emerged in a context heavily influenced by Canaanite religion. The Hebrew Bible itself acknowledges that Israelites sometimes worshipped Baal and other gods alongside 𝗆𝗏, for example in the Book of Kings and the Prophets' condemnations. In Amos 5:26, there is a direct mention of Kiyan, often interpreted as a name for Saturn. You have lifted up the shrine of your king, the pedestal of your idols, the star of your god Kiyan, which you made for yourselves. Many scholars believe Kiyan here a reference to Saturn via its Mesopotamian name. This suggests that while 𝗆𝗏ism itself was centered on 𝗆𝗏, some Israelites also engaged in Saturn veneration at certain points, likely as part of broader syncretism. Saturn and the color black. Saturn's archetype has long been one of solemn authority and structure, and in esoteric traditions, the planet is symbolized by the color black. This association is echoed in the formal black robes worn by judges, priests, and academics, garments that convey dignity, restraint, and governance, qualities Saturn was believed to rule over. There is a link between ancient Saturn worship to modern ceremonial dress. The symbolism is striking. Saturn as Lord of the Rings. The planet is now famous for its vast, encircling rings, a discovery only possible with the invention of the telescope. Yet the motif of the ring appears in ancient jewelry and rituals, earrings, wedding rings, signet rings, objects of binding, unity, and eternal cycles. In symbolic terms, these circular forms mirror Saturn's perceived dominion over time and boundaries, giving rise to the title Lord of the Rings, Saturn, and linguistics. Language adds another layer to the Saturnian narrative. Some researchers claim that in the Old Phoenician language, Saturn was called 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗏, and that the weekly Sabbath was an inherited Saturn rite. However, that statement is misleading. Here's a more accurate context. Mainstream linguistics traces the Hebrew Shabbat to the root meaning, to cease, or to rest, viewing it as a covenantal practice, and refers to the weekly day of rest, distinct from planetary worship. Not the planet Saturn itself. The connection to Saturn comes from later interpretations and comparative linguistics. In Roman culture, the day of Saturn, dies Saturni, corresponds to the Sabbath in Jewish tradition. Some occult or esoteric sources later link Shabbat symbolically with Saturn, but this is not an ancient Phoenician linguistic fact. The overlap between the Jewish Sabbath and the Roman Saturday, Saturn's day, has kept this theory alive in esoteric and occult circles. Saturn and ancient symbolic geometry. From occultism to modern rocketry, the geometric six-pointed star, or hexagram, adds layers of symbolic complexity that traverse ancient religion, mysticism, and modern technology. While widely known today as the Star of David, its adoption as a Jewish emblem occurred in the medieval period. In occult literature and alternative interpretations, it is often called the Star of Saturn, linking its six-point symmetry to the planet associated with law, cycles, and cosmic authority. This hexagonal symmetry appears strikingly in the six-sided cloud pattern at Saturn's north pole, observed by NASA, a modern echo of ancient symbolic geometry. The story of NASA itself intersects with both occult and historical currents. Its development relied heavily on German rocket scientists from the Nazi program, most famously Wernher von Braun, whose early rockets were called Saturn rockets, embedding the planet's name into the program. Meanwhile, American occultist and rocket engineer Jack Parsons, a follower of Aleister Crowley's Thelemic practices, reportedly performed rituals intended to invoke spiritual energies to aid his rocketry experiments, merging mystical symbolism with technological ambition. In this way, the hexagram, Saturn, occult philosophy, Nazi-era rocketry, and early NASA programs form a continuum in which ancient symbolic geometry and planetary mythology persistently reappear, demonstrating how cosmic and mystical motifs have been reinterpreted across religious, esoteric, and scientific domains. The Seal of Solomon, the Star of Saturn, a Near Eastern religious influence. The Seal of Solomon, a six-pointed hexagram formed by two interlocking triangles, has long been associated with protection, cosmic balance, and the harmony of opposites in Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and later esoteric traditions. Over time, mystics connected this hexagram with Saturn, the planet symbolizing structure, law, cycles, and cosmic authority, partly because of its 6 points, and its representation of order and regulation in the universe. While ancient texts do not explicitly call the hexagram the Star of Saturn, this interpretation emerged in medieval and later occult systems, blending sacred geometry with planetary symbolism. The symbolic association of Saturn with the hexagram will also trace back, indirectly, to Canaanite, Phoenician, and Amorite religious ideas, where celestial bodies, cycles, and cosmic order played key roles in worship. Canaanite deities such as Baal and El were linked to storms, fertility, and authority, while some gods were depicted with serpent or solar features, reflecting the interplay of cosmic and chthonic forces. Phoenician and early Israelite religious practices incorporated these motifs, including astral symbolism, cyclical festivals, and solar, serpent imagery, creating a cultural environment in which Saturnian attributes time, cycles, law, and cosmic order became embedded in symbolic forms like the hexagram. Thus, the seal of Solomon as the star of Saturn represents a continuity of celestial and divine symbolism, connecting ancient Near Eastern cosmology to later Jewish mysticism and esoteric traditions. Capitoline Hill, Saturn, and Masonic symbolism in Capitol Hill. Capitoline Hill in ancient Rome was not only a religious center, but also a political hub, dominated by temples to major deities including Saturn. The Temple of Saturn represented wealth, governance, and the orderly flow of time, linking divine authority with civic structure. When the United States established its seat of government, Capitol Hill was intentionally designed to echo classical Roman ideals, drawing inspiration from the symbolism of Roman civic and religious architecture. Many of the founding planners and architects, including prominent Freemasons, incorporated layers of Masonic symbolism into the Capitol's design. These included elements representing order, law, cyclical time, and cosmic authority, all attributes historically associated with Saturn. Columns, pediments, and even the placement of the building within the landscape were aligned with these classical principles, embedding subtle symbolic homage to Saturnian concepts of hierarchy and governance. In this way, Capitol Hill can be seen as a modern continuation of the ancient tradition in Saturn, sacred civic space, and the exercise of power, reflecting both Roman precedent and Masonic esoteric influence. Summary narrative: the Canaanites, a blend of local Levantines and Amorite migrants, developed a shared pantheon, language, and urban culture. From this route, the Phoenicians carried Canaanite religion across the Mediterranean, where 𝗏𝗲𝗄𝗏 merged with Cronus, Saturn, in Greek and Roman thought. The Israelites, also of Canaanite stock, began with a syncretistic faith where 𝗖𝗆𝗍 coexisted with other deities, including those tied to planetary worship, a fact hinted at in biblical condemnations of Kian, or Saturn. Over centuries, Israelite religion became strictly monotheistic, but groups both from within Judaism and Gentiles alike continued to identify 𝗖𝗆𝗍 with Saturn, particularly because of the Sabbath's alignment with Saturn's day. Meanwhile, Carthaginian religion preserved a direct Bull-Saturn link, keeping alive one of the most explicit survivals of Saturn worship from the Canaanite past. Conclusion: Saturn has played a multifaceted role in the religious, cultural, and symbolic imagination of civilizations across the Near East and beyond. While 𝗖𝗆𝗍 was not originally a Saturn deity, early Israelite religion emerged within a broader Canaanite and Amorite milieu in which planetary, solar, and serpent symbolism were integral. The figure of Saturn intertwined with deities like Baal and 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, influencing Phoenician, Carthaginian, and eventually Greco-Roman religious thought. Its symbolic resonance extended into sacred geometry, ceremonial dress, the hexagram, and ritual observances, and persisted into esoteric, Masonic, and even modern technological contexts, from Capitol Hill to NASA rockets. Through this continuity, Saturn demonstrates how ancient celestial and mythological motifs can endure and evolve, linking the cosmic, the political, and the technological in a vast tapestry of human history, belief, and symbolism.